This is joint work with Monica Pietresi and Martin Schneider, and as Veronica mentioned, Monica is in the audience to take part in the discussion today. So to set the stage, let me start by showing you some new data patterns we document on houses and families. So this figure shows the home ownership rate across European countries. The bars correspond to the total fraction of the population in each country and are normalized to 1. So this is going to be 100% of the economy. Their position relative to the vertical line at 0 corresponds to the ownership rate. So all the mass to the left here are people who are in owner-occupied housing, whereas the mass to the right are renters. The aggregate home ownership rate differs widely across European countries, from about 90% here in Slovakia to less than 50% in Germany. Now, let me show you what we mean by family structure and how that differs across countries. The green bars here are the fraction of the population that are single households. These are people who live without a spouse or a partner. Now focus for a second just on the size of the bars, and you'll see that as you move down, those green bars tend to get larger. What this means is that simply that in countries with higher home ownership rates, like Slovenia or Slovakia, there's much fewer single households than in countries with low ownership rates, like Austria and Germany. The red bars are the flip side of that. So those are the share of adults that are part of a couple household. Here we actually don't see much of a difference across countries in terms of the total size of the bars. So the share of adults who live in a household with a partner is fairly constant across countries with different home ownership rates. But there's a clear pattern within each country, namely that the green single households are much more likely to rent than the red couple household. So while this is true in all countries, visually it's actually easiest to see in countries with low home ownership rate. So Monica and I, for some reason, still seem to disagree as to whether Germany or Austria is the best country, but since I'm the one presenting, I'm going to use Austria as an example. So among renters here, almost 50% of households are singles. Among owners, on the other hand, that fraction is much smaller at about 20%. Okay, so we talked about singles, we talked about couples, but what about the rest? So who are these adults that are neither single nor couple households? Well, they live with moms and dads. The yellow bars here correspond to adult children living with their parents. And here we see two patterns. First, there are a lot more of these kinds of households in high ownership countries. And second, they predominantly live in owner-occupied instead of rental housing. So these patterns we document motivate us to jointly study how households are formed and how ownership is chosen, which is what we do in this paper. We're going to develop a theory of household choice that jointly determines housing, savings, and family structure. The key new element we bring to the table is that we take a closer look at under the hood of housing and carefully model the production of housing services. In order to enjoy these housing services, households need to purchase two kinds of inputs. First, there are standard inputs such as land and structures that are used to configure the physical house. Second, in order to enjoy these so far very empty houses, people need to purchase a number of complementary goods like furniture or utilities. The details of the production of housing services now depends on family structure. While couples can at least partially share land and structures, they require more of some of the elements of this complementary good. Their utilities bill will be higher, and they're going to need 2 desks to work from home during a pandemic. The second new feature of the model is that we endogenize family structure by allowing young agents to cohabit with parents. Cohabitation in the model is going to provide informal rental and credit markets within the household. We're going to embed this theory of housing and the family into a standard model of tenure choice in which agents trade off a lower productivity of renting against a collateral down payment constraint. This setup then delivers a rich set of predictions which we confront with the new data patterns. In particular, we're going to use model predictions to explain how savings, tenure choice, and family structure co-vary both within and across countries. Here's a preview of what we find. So as in standard life cycle models with housing, ownership and the desire to save are tightly linked. As a result, home ownership is less common among young agents who expect a higher income growth in the future and don't want to save. Since owning requires a down payment, owners typically have higher wealth than renters. Now, our theory of housing production in the family allows us to explain why singles rent more than couples. Couples spend less on land and structures because they can share that input. And so for them, the per capita down payment requirement for a house is lower, and they're more likely to choose to own. This particular setup delivers 2 additional predictions that we then confirm in the data. First, singles have higher expenditure shares on housing than couples. And second, among owners, singles save more than couples. The way we model this production of housing services is actually crucial for the results 2 and 3. So you could have tried to explain the fact that couples own more than singles also with some sort of preference story, like the idea that couples are already more settled down and expect to move less, but such an explanation could not account for differential expenditure shares and differential savings rates among owners. When thinking about differences in ownership rates across countries, we then argue that there's 2 forces at play: frictions in rental markets and frictions in credit markets. While both of these frictions are going to affect ownership rates in a similar way, they have very different implications for cohabitations and savings. With higher frictions in rental markets, the ownership rate is higher, but because renting is more expensive, more children live with their parents. The young that nonetheless choose to move out are more likely to own and save for the down payment. Now, similar to these high frictions in rental markets, lower frictions in credit markets also increase ownership, but actually lead to lower savings and cohabitation. It's now easier for young households to move out so they're less likely to cohabit with parents. So in an economy with lower credit frictions, buying a house also requires less of a down payment, and so we would expect that aggregate savings could be lower. We're going to argue that both of these forces are at play in different sets of countries. And put simply, we're going to say within Northern Europe, differences in ownership rates are driven by credit frictions, but within the South, they're driven by rental frictions. So for example, we're going to argue that Finland has higher home ownership than Germany because access to credit is easier in Finland. But we're going to say Italy has higher ownership than Germany because it has higher frictions in rental markets. So here's the outline for the remaining minutes today. I'm going to start by showing you a model in which family structure is exogenous. That's really going to allow me to focus on this production of housing services and how that depends on family structure. I'll then show you the main predictions of that setup and compare them to the data. Then we'll come back to the model and introduce cohabitation. And with the full model at hand, we can then think of comparing different countries and assessing the role of credit versus rental friction. So agents in the model live for 3 periods, and their income is going to be relatively low when they're young, high in middle age, and then low again when old and retired, which captures a simple life cycle profile. For now, household side is exogenous, and agents are either single or live with a partner in a couple household. People are going to get utility from consumption, which is a private good, and housing services that are consumed at the household level. Housing services and consumption are going to be separate. These housing services consist of 2 kinds of goods. So first, there's the physical house, which is assembled from land and structures. These lands and structures can be purchased or rented in housing markets. And then second, in order to enjoy utility from the house, people have to heat and cool it, they have to furnish it, and they have to spend some resources cleaning and maintaining it. And this kind of bundle is what we're going to refer to as the complementary good. The relative importance of the 2 kinds of goods depends on family structure. So why might that be? Well, for instance, couples need only 1 kitchen and 1 bathroom, meaning they can at least partially share this land and structures. But part of the complementary good cannot be shared. For example, you're going to need more utilities and more frequent cleaning when more people live in the house. You're also going to need more of that furniture that I mentioned at the beginning, like the second desk, or importantly, a second set of noise-canceling headphones so you can both work from home together. This particular feature of the production technology of housing services implies that for couples, the consumption bundle is going to be more tilted towards the complementary good, and they spend relatively less on structures than singles. Now, to enjoy utility from land and structures, households can either own or rent them. The complementary good, on the other hand, is always a flow expense, irrespective of ownership status of the house. The key trade-off households face when deciding whether to rent or own is the following. Owning requires a down payment, meaning that at least part of the house purchase has to be financed with savings. In the model, we're going to capture that with a standard friction in credit markets or a collateral constraint. Renting, on the other hand, doesn't require such savings, but it has a higher user cost in owning. And this captures any kind of frictions in rental markets, such as administrative costs or moral hazard, by which we mean the fact that renters might not be able to commit to take good care of a house, and it depreciates faster. This setup is going to deliver a tight connection between homeownership rates and savings. So the higher a household's desire to save, the more likely they are to be willing to finance that down payment in order to avoid the frictional rental. Now, that specific trade-off between renting and owning is different for singles and for couples. And that's because couples can share land and structures, but not the full complementary good. So they're going to spend less on this durable asset, land and structures, than do singles. The per capita down payment requirement is therefore lower and less savings are required for home ownership. As a result, all else equals, couples are more likely to choose to own than singles. So formally, what we do in the paper is that we first derive a set of ownership thresholds and analyze how they vary as a function of fundamentals such as age, the income profile, and family status. And then second, together with assumptions on that distribution of fundamentals, we can prove a number of propositions about the aggregate household sector in the economy. So I'll spare you the details of the notations and the proof, and instead I'll now show you directly the main theoretical results, and we'll confront them with the data. The first set of results we're going to look at is a direct implication of this new housing technology we propose. So as in standard models, we're going to find that expenditure shares on housing are independent of age and wealth, but importantly here, they do depend on family status. In particular, singles spend more on rent than couples. Now, okay, let me first show you this first prediction in the data, and then I'll move on to the second. So what I'm plotting here is average expenditure shares on rent by age group and wealth. These are averages across about 12 European countries. The dots are the mean expenditure share across countries in each age group. And as you see, renters of all ages spend about a third of their consumption on rent. The triangle, upward and downward facing, now plot the expenditure shares at the 10th and 90th percentile of the wealth distribution respectively. So while it is true that richer households tend to spend a little bit less on rent, the magnitudes are small. And in fact, in some of the age groups, you really have to squint to even see these triangles. So in particular, this variation of expenditure shares by wealth is really small compared to the variation by family status. The green dots here are the expenditure shares for singles. The red ones are the expenditure shares for couples. So as there's theory of housing services and the family predict, singles spend more on rent than do couples at all ages. And here I also want to point out that the difference is actually quite substantial. So if you just look at, say, the 40 to 50-year-olds, then you'll see that the difference in expenditure shares is almost 10 percentage points. So next, we're going to turn to...
Sorry, this is the expenditure of a person in the couple or both person in the couple versus the person?
This is household level. So the expenditure here at the household consumption level. Exactly. Yeah. So next, I'm going to show you some results on tenure choice. So again, as in standard models, households who expect higher income growth are going to own less because they're most affected by this down payment requirement. And again, this is clearly borne out in the data. So here, instead of expenditure shares, I'm plotting average ownership rates by countries. Young agents who are on the upward sloping part of their labor earnings are predominantly renters, whereas older people who save for retirement predominantly own. With our family structures, we now get an additional prediction, which is that couples own more than singles. And here in the figure, I confirm that this pattern I showed you at the beginning is not only true for Austria, but holds on average across all countries and for all age groups. So, and again, the magnitudes are large. So if you focus on, as before, on the 40 to 50-year-olds, then less than about 55% of singles are owner on average across countries, but almost 80% of the couples. The third prediction then is about savings. So as in standard models, there's going to be a tight connection between ownership and savings. And we predict that owners save more than renters. This is easily confirmed in the data. So here, what I'm showing you is a simple regression, linear regression of household wealth to income on a set of country by age fixed effects and a dummy for ownership. Now, while renters have a wealth to income ratio of about 2, this goes up to almost 9 for owners. So remember, in our model, the fundamental reason why singles are less likely to be willing to own than couples is that effectively they have a higher per capita down payment requirement. So this mechanism would directly imply that conditional on owning, singles should have higher savings than couples. And we test that by running the same regression as before, but adding both a single dummy and an interaction between single and owner. So notice first that among renters here, there's really no difference in savings between singles and couples, either economically or statistically. Among owners, on the other hand, our prediction is borne out. So single owners have significantly higher wealth to income ratios than couples. And here I'd like to point out again that the way we model the production of housing services at the household level is really crucial to generate both of these predictions on savings simultaneously. So the fact that you see no difference in savings among renters, but you see it among owners. So again, for example, if we try to explain the differential ownership rates in the previous picture with a preference story, then we would have had a hard time matching these facts and the co-movements between family status and state. So now I'm going to move on and enrich the model to allow for cohabitation. Cohabitation here means that young agents in the model have an extra option to move in with their parents. Before talking about the theory, let me show you in the data that cohabitation is an important phenomenon to study, at least in some countries. The left graph here shows the share of adults by age that live with their parents. The right one's going to show the flip side of that. So the share of adults that have an adult child, the share of adults that have an adult child living with them. The gray lines correspond to all the different countries in our sample. Now let me illustrate two of the countries in a little bit more detail. First, let's start with Italy, who is on the high end of the cohabitation spectrum. So in Italy, a large fraction of even the 35 to 40-year-olds live with their parents. And on the flip side, over half of the households aged 50 to 60 have an adult child living with them. On the other extreme, we have Finland, where cohabitation is basically just not a phenomenon beyond the age of 25. Everybody has moved out. And on the flip side, less than 10% of households aged 50 to 60 have an adult child living with them. We're going to model this by allowing young singles to have an additional third option. So they can move out and rent or own, or they can move in with their parents or continue to live with their parents. Now, similar to cohabitation between partners, land and structures are going to be shared between parents and children, but more of the complementary good is needed. I think that's very intuitive. Kids tend to take very long hot showers and need a PlayStation. Now, formally, what's going to happen is that the young make a take it or leave it offer to parents. And in that take it or leave it offer, they propose consumption for all household members, as well as household services and ownership status for the family. And they also propose how to then split assets when parents and children go their separate way in the next period. Now, since all of these choices are made at the household level, there's only one budget constraint and one borrowing constraint. And on top of that, housing is shared within the family. So what cohabitation effectively does is it creates an informal rental and credit market. So why doesn't everybody then live with their parents? Well, the reason is it's a little bit embarrassing to do so. More formally in the model, we're going to allow for an idiosyncratic utility cost of cohabitation, such that agents are going to move in with their parents if and only if the gains from doing so exceed that cost. Now, intuitively, the gains of cohabitation are higher when the young have low income. Why is that? Then they have more to gain from sharing resources with their parents. And also when their parents have high savings, because then these parents can easily provide them these informal credit markets. We confirm both of these intuitions in the data, but I'm not going to show you this in the interest of time, and instead focus on the second prediction. Namely that the benefits of cohabitation, meaning of having this informal rental and credit markets with parents, is higher when formal credit and rental markets have higher frictions. I'm now going to formalize this intuition and show you in the last kind of couple minutes how it can help us think about ownership rates across countries. So when thinking about ownership rates across countries, we allow for two main forces: frictions in rental markets and frictions in credit markets. Rental market frictions effectively in the model increase the user cost of renting, and they capture anything like administrative costs or regulations. So we think, for example, they might be higher in Italy, where it used to be almost impossible to get rid of a tenant, even when they weren't paying rent, and so landlords were very reluctant to rent out their apartments. Credit market frictions in the model are literally a down payment requirement, but more generally, they're going to capture how cheap or easy it is for households to access credit. For example, we think that they might be lower in the Netherlands, where at least there used to be interest-only mortgages. Now, in the paper, we proved two sets of propositions. The first one is related to rental markets. So think of an economy with higher frictions in rental markets. In such an economy, the home ownership rate is going to be higher. Renting is more expensive, so more households find it worthwhile to own despite the down payment requirement. In such an economy, there's also going to be more cohabitation.
You have 5 minutes, sorry.
Perfect. When formal rental markets have higher frictions, there's more benefits to living with parents. So higher rental frictions give you higher ownership, but also more cohabitation. Third, we showed that the savings of the young are going to be higher in such an economy. This last result is mostly driven by those young agents that still prefer to be independent, so they don't cohabit with parents, but now they're more likely to choose to be owners and have to save for the down payment. Now let me contrast that with the effect of lower credit market frictions. When agents can finance a larger part of the house purchase with credit, we also get that the home ownership rate is higher, but now there's less cohabitation. Young households can now more easily enjoy the benefits of home ownership and avoid kind of the expensive rental market while still moving out and being independent. The overall effect of savings in the economy is ambiguous, but I would like to point out that there is a strong force pushing for lower aggregate saving, namely that in an economy with lower credit market frictions, all homeowners need to save less for a down payment than if those credit market frictions were high. And now in the final step, I'm going to use these two propositions to think a little bit about the co-movement of ownership, about ownership rates across countries, and how the co-movement between these three variables can help us tease these two factors apart. So this is a scatter plot of ownership rates at the country level against, on the left, the fraction of adult children living with their parents, and on the right, the aggregate savings relative to income of the young. The countries in blue here are all Northern European countries, whereas the pink ones are the South and the East. The reason we split countries into these two groups is because it looks like within the South, differences are driven by rental markets, but within the North, it's all about credit markets. Since there's a lot of formal theory in the paper, which I didn't show you in the talk, but I hope you trust me, I now hope that you will allow me this one cross-country regression to conclude. So what these lines illustrate is that within Northern European countries, higher home ownership rate is associated with less cohabitation between parents and children and less savings. And that's consistent with credit markets driving the differences in home ownership rates. Well-functioning credit markets allow the young, for instance, in Finland, to move out and form their own household. My pen is not working anymore. There. Now, in Germany, on the other hand, where access to credit is harder, they're more likely to live with parents. A higher fraction of adults live with their parents. But those Germans that still do move out now need to save more for the down payment than their Finnish counterparts, and aggregate savings are high. Now, within Southern Europe, but also if you compare the group of the Southern countries to the group of the Northern countries, higher home ownership rate is associated with more cohabitation and more savings. And that's consistent with rental markets driving the frictions. So let's use Italy as the second example. In Italy, we say that higher frictions in rental markets make it hard for kids to move out, and they stay at home a lot longer than their German counterparts who can move out because rental markets are just super efficient. Those Italians that do move out are more likely to be owners and have high savings to afford the down payment, and they kind of do anything they can to avoid these frictional rental markets. And with that, very much on time, let me conclude. So what we did in this paper is developed a joint theory of savings, housing, and household formation. The key new element we bring to the table is that we take a closer look at this production of housing services at the household level. In order to enjoy household services, people need both land and structures to live in, but also utilities and furniture in order to be able to enjoy their houses. The importance of the two kinds of goods depends on the number of household members. So while land and structures can more easily be shared within the household, couples need to spend more on water, on cleaning services, and on certain kinds of furniture. They therefore spend more on the complementary good, which is a flow expense, and less on the durable assets, land and structure. This setup helps us explain why in all countries, couples have higher home ownership rates than singles. It also predicts that couple renters spend less on housing than singles, and they save less conditional on being owned. Both of these we showed to be borne out in the data. We then enriched the model by allowing for young agents to live with parents, which provides informal rental and credit markets. These cohabitation patterns in the full model then help us to think about the role of rental and credit frictions for differences in home ownership rate across European countries. While both higher rental frictions and lower credit frictions push for higher home ownership rates, they're going to have opposite predictions for cohabitations and savings. And I then concluded the talk by showing you that the data is consistent with Germany having lower ownership than Italy because its rental markets are super efficient, but lower ownership than Finland because its credit markets are less efficient.
Let me start first with just a summary of what this paper does. So this paper studies the joint variation of family structure, housing, and savings across European countries. So this paper is basically at the intersection of two very interesting literatures, housing and families in macro. That's the way I see it. And both of these literatures are relatively new, have gotten a lot of strengths in macro in the last couple of decades. So it's an exciting paper trying to pick elements from both of these literatures in trying to address this variation in ownership across European countries. One contribution of this paper, which I think is really nice, are all these stylized facts about Europe. And in particular, the authors go through a lot of detail on how renters versus owners differ across different countries in Europe. So I thought that was a nice contribution of the paper. And what the paper does in terms of allowing for some exogenous variation within the model is to have variation across individuals within a country that is given by taste for owning, marital status, which is exogenous, so either they are going to be single or they have somebody else they live with, and income profiles. And then across countries, the emphasis of the model is on differences between rental market frictions and credit market frictions. So it's a nice set of variation both within countries and across countries that the model incorporates. So let me just take a few seconds here to show a little bit what I think is the key model's component, and that's something Alessandra just mentioned as well. So this here is the utility, lifetime utility of individuals in this model. The model has is a 3-period model. This is when you're young, when you're middle-aged, and when you're old. And as you see, there is a Cobb-Douglas structure between consumption and expenditures in housing services. So this Cobb-Douglas structure is justified in terms of the data because of the share of housing spending being pretty much constant across income. So that's the justification for this part. But the most important part of the paper is this one here. So this is the housing services technology, where this piece over here, you can think of it as a TFP that depends on that taste for owning versus renting. L is the land, and this nicely on TF here, which is between a structure, so actually the home, and this M, which is what they call the maintenance of complementary spending, which drives a lot of results in the model. This alpha here, as I'll show you in a minute, is where all the key intuitions are. So I'm going to just assume, just take everything else equal and just look at the technological restrictions imposed by the Leon TF component here. So when we look at different types of households in the model, what we find is the following, that S, which is these structures, the demand for structures in this model, is going to be linked to the spending in these complementary goods, which include utilities and furniture, etc. They are going to be linked in a way that there is variation depending on the type of household. So in particular, the households that are going to be having the highest rent spending are going to be, or the highest structure spending, are going to be those single owners. And now this alpha here is going to change. And what you see is that there are two main wedges. There is this delta here, which drives a wedge between the single owner and the couple owner. And it works in a way that you're a couple owner, because you have more complementary expenditures, because you need the 2 desks, the 2 headphones, etc. You are going to have a relatively low S/M ratio. And what this does here is that it makes it that if you're a single owner, you're going to save more than a couple owner, simply because you are going to demand more structures, which is going to require a larger down payment. Then when you go down here to the renters, you see the second wedge in the model, which is this tau. This tau is the rental friction in the markets, and that varies across countries. And that makes it that if you happen to be a couple renter, you are going to face so high costs of maintaining this maintenance expenditure because you're a couple, so you need 2 hot showers and you need the 2 desks, but you also have to deal with the rental market friction. So it is these couple renters, the ones who have the lowest S/M in the model. So that's kind of, this structure here is built very cleverly, I think, in order to exactly speak to the data facts that the authors document. And as you see, all this S/M ratio is going to really depend on the couples versus singles in the model rather than owner versus renter rather than income or wealth. The cohabitation portion of the paper, I also find it very innovative.
Marla, just to say you have 3 minutes.
Oh, okay, so I hurry up. So how about this? The paper is elegant. The paper rings a bell, and I think the paper has a very nice balance between the math and the economic intuition. It's just a gorgeous paper. It's written in a way that has a lot of economic insight. So here are my comments, so accelerate a little bit. So the first one has to do with housing expenditure over the life cycle. So when I look at least at US data, I don't have the data the authors have, but when I look at US data, I see that there is a hump shape in the consumption of non-durable goods, which is widely known. But once you put in housing expenditures, which is rent, either by renters or by imputing rent to owners, what you see is that the profile is actually quite flat. You don't see this drop. What that means is that, and you can confirm that, is that expenditures in rent, which are these diamonds here, even in utilities, go up. So somehow the authors and Alessandra showed us this, there is some sort of independence of this rent to consumption ratio when you go across the life cycle. But there is some sort of disconnect. I don't know how to put together this fact versus the facts that are documented for the US. The only thing might be that then when you don't look at just people who rent, but you also look at owners and you look at the imputed rent, that's kind of part of the reason why you see the disconnect on the graph that I showed before. My second comment, I think, is the paper would benefit from a little bit more of cross-country institutional details. For instance, I was hoping to see a little bit of a table showing differences in down payments across different countries in Europe, and some sort of rental market indicators that will give us a sense of whether those rental frictions are really very different across countries. I think that would be interesting to have. Also, you wondered about transaction costs, tax deductibility of mortgage rates, capital gain taxes, and looking a little bit more at how these things vary across countries in the paper will benefit from that. The rest of my comments have to do more with, as a reader, when I think about this connection between ownership, renting, and the family, some things came to mind that I think would be nice for the paper, that we will discuss in the paper. So one thing that I found some evidence that when you look within countries, ownership seems to be higher outside large cities, which kind of tells us that if in a particular country we have the same credit markets and the same rental markets, then there is something about just the housing stock in large cities versus non-large cities. So there is some sort of spatial component there with housing stock and the housing supply, which of course is endogenous, that would be probably giving some insights into those differences within countries. Then there is also evidence for Europe from this paper that there is a difference between marriage and cohabitation by couples. So in the paper, there is a lot of emphasis on 1 versus 2 as what determines the spending in rents versus in these complementary goods. But there seems to be a difference on being institutionally married versus just cohabiting in ownership rates across Europe. And there is some evidence in this paper here. The other thing I thought about is the following. So in the paper, there is no uncertainty, there is no portfolio choice in the model. However, when I look at the data and I see the high ownership rates in Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Greece, Italy, what I'm wondering here is it that part of the reason why ownership is so high in those countries is just simply that people don't know where else to put their savings. People don't want to buy government bonds. You know, in Italy is famous for, telling the banks that they are obliged to get certain government bonds. And people just put all their savings into housing. That's the portfolio choice. So I wonder whether there is a friction in there that is not a credit market friction, is not a rental market friction, but that also explains from the portfolio choice perspective, the high ownership rates. Then thinking about a paper.
Yeah. You should wrap up.
Thinking a paper about family transfers and thinking a paper about family and housing, I wonder just about the role of family transfers, housing bequests, housing donations. Actually, there are a bunch of papers for different countries, Austria, Denmark, Italy, France. Even I have written something for the US where parents actually give inter vivos transfers for children who are buying homes as down payment. My last point is cohabitation, and I call it other suspects. And I just wanted to bring up the labor markets. So there are a number of papers out there. Actually, Alessandra has one of those papers about Italy. So there is a lot of conversation in the paper. There's a lot of point in the paper about rental markets, cohabitation, and ownership. But there is a literature out there that talks about also labor market frictions as the ones that are actually relevant to think about cohabitation in a bunch of countries in Europe, even in the United States. There is even one paper about cohabitational culture, but I'll just leave it there. I think that it's a very interesting paper, very thought-provoking. I just wanted to provide some comments as to other things the paper could discuss or maybe extend. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. So I would say let's see first if there are some questions, and then you can answer both to Marla and the other questions. Can I raise your hand? Okay, I have 2 hands raised. Let me see if I see them. Elena, Raquel. Okay, let's start with Elena. Then I have Raquel and Ilse.
Hi, Monica and Alessandra. So I had some problem with the audio, so I don't know if you talked about it. I didn't hear. I was wondering whether you could comment on difference in taxations across countries. There could be one difference why renters, the compositions of married and unmarried couples the distribution of married and married couples among renters and owners get difference across countries, but just because the tax system treats these couples differently in terms, for instance, of home ownership, mortgage deductions. Thank you.
Great. Let's collect all the questions so that then you can answer. So Raquel?
Yeah, so that was a nice paper. I was wondering if you had a thought about maybe the complementary goods tending to be children themselves rather than the cleaning services, etc. And then also kind of related to children, but it's really the fertility rate. Most of the countries there, I'm not sure about Slovenia or Slovakia, but most of the countries that you have there are countries of low fertility. And so they're putting far less pressure in terms of the housing market. I wonder what you thought about that, driving things.
Ilse?
Yeah, hi, thanks for the great talk. I was just going to follow up on Marla's point on labor markets, and I was wondering whether if you control for youth unemployment in your last regressions that relate home ownership rate to the likelihood of children cohabiting with their parents, whether the results would be unaltered.
Well, thank you for the great discussion, Marla. That tons of points that I'm not going to go through one for one because I think we want to save time for questions, but you gave us a lot of food for thought. So let me start from the back and then go up. So is about the labor markets and youth unemployment. So what that really matters for is cohabitation patterns within countries. So one of the strong predictors we find for like you living with your parents is whether you are employed or not, and then the income you have conditional on being employed. For the cross-country component, we could definitely kind of try that. That's a nice suggestion. Then Raquel, I think there were sort of two things almost you mentioned. One is sort of what about kind of young children? And there we sort of purposely abstract from them in the household, because if you try to kind of explain ownership decisions by sort of basic demographics, then the moment you control for whether this is a single or a couple household or the number of adults in the household, young children don't seem to matter anymore for ownership rates. Then the second one about the fertility rate, so that would kind of matter as long as there's sort of transaction costs and delay in sort of building and in construction here. So point well taken, the approach we kind of take here is more about long run differences across countries where sort of structures and houses in general were able to kind of adapt to other market conditions. And then Elena, so I'm not 100% sure that I understood your question, but I think it was sort of about whether kind of cohabitation in marriage is driven partly by differences in tax rate as in
I was thinking whether the difference between owning or renting is affected by how the tax system of different countries treats income and payments, for instance, towards mortgages for single couples.
Okay, so I mean that could definitely be part of the reason. I think there's a way in which the kind of rental market friction that we have in the model could be viewed as sort of like a net cost. but yeah, so that could definitely be kind of part of what drives these differences in TAUs across countries. In terms of like whether that affects the ownership decisions by single couples, I don't think we have much to say about that, but we could look at that because we also know within a household whether people are married or not. So we could kind of see if that says anything. I don't know, Monica, if you wanted to add to any of those.
I want to talk about the initial fact that Marla showed about spending by age. The patterns for renters is the cleanest, that they're basically expenditure shares are independent of age for renters. And then for owners, there's other considerations that come in that would generate this increasing pattern in homeownership spending by age. That's also true in our model, but just the clean expenditure shares, the fact is the cleanest for renters.
So we have 3 more questions. So if you are very quick, I let you ask them all. And then, so we have Sydney, Arlene, and Alessandra. Sydney?
My question was just related to Raquel's, actually. It's a super interesting and seems relevant framework that rings a bell, as Marla aptly put, but it seems like it has implications for fertility decisions, and in turn that would have interesting implications for these housing and family structures. That's probably a topic for a whole nother paper, but you might have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting too. My question was partly related to Raquel's question too, but with a slightly different angle. I was actually wondering whether you thought there might be different rental frictions across segments of the housing market, especially standalone houses versus apartments. I guess the story I had in mind when you shared the facts was that maybe couples need larger standalone houses when they have kids. And suppose there's more frictions in the rental market for standalone houses and it's easier to rent in apartments. That leads them, when they have kids and become a couple, to be more likely to buy a home. And at the same time, I thought maybe once you have kids, you kind of have to save more because of planned expenditure, college and other sorts of things. So then you get both the savings and the home ownership. So I thought maybe you could tease apart that by looking at trends for couples that have children versus couples without, and that will just like separate technology versus this kid story.
Yes, very nice paper. It actually was a flashback for me because it kind of reminded me of my job market paper. So it's a bit of a comment because it's putting together this paper as well as Ilse comment about labor markets. So what I found when I was working on this stuff was that there is clearly this relationship across countries in family structure, credit constraints, as well as labor market policies and unemployment rates of young people. So it is, so in that paper, I sort of built a model in which there was a second best solution to the labor markets, which was employment protection as a second best when you have credit constraints. That is, you kind of protect, the job of the older generation at the expenses of the young generation because they are all living together as an effect of the credit constraints. So basically, there is that relationship is, makes sense. They sort of like, they may well be all linked together, and the family structure being sort of the endogenous mechanism through which that links the two.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so if we've less than a minute, then Sydney, I'm going to say that's an interesting suggestion. We can definitely sort of look into that possibly in a follow-up paper. Although I would have to sort of be very clear on like what the difference in terms of the fertility decision is between renting and owning. Then Arlene, so back when we looked at it, we had found that sort of the presence of young children doesn't actually matter much. I definitely remember it for tenure. I think we did it for savings also, but that's actually a nice suggestion that we should probably show that as well. And then Alessandra, if I understand correctly, you're sort of suggesting that maybe part of why we want to move in together and create that informal rental has to do with labor markets. Yeah, I think then the kind of key question is, do you need to live under the same roof to provide that those transfers between kind of parents and children, which I think some people here have actually worked on extensively. I don't know, Monica, if you wanted to add anything about the about the rental frictions in different segments of the housing markets, because
this is a great comment. So I love all the comments. Thanks so much for all the comments, because this is going to give us the opportunity to look in that we can do much more with the data, and so we can look at actually whether these things, both the Marla's comment about the rural areas, as well as the comment on Arlene's comment about the cohabitation. So this gives us great food for thought